What's going on? It's Fight Season MMA, and today I want to do a full breakdown of the top 15 UFC bantamweight rankings, talk about each fighter and why they are an important part and a key place in the UFC bantamweight rankings. The bantamweight division currently is probably the most stacked division inside the UFC. It has some of the most just absolute killers in the division, and it is one of the hardest divisions to become champion in, and Sean O'Malley is the current champion, so there's a lot of props going to O'Malley there. But I just want to talk about how absolutely stacked the division is and kind of break it down fighter by fighter and give my own top 15 bantamweight rankings for the current UFC top 50 bantamweights. If you guys enjoy the UFC content, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so please leave a subscription. It is the best way to support the channel, and while you're down there, please turn on the post notifications. It is always good for you guys to turn on the post notifications just so you guys do not miss a video when it's released. But let's jump in to my top 15 bantamweight rankings and a full top 15 bantamweight breakdown. At number 15, we have Montel Jackson. Montel Jackson just beat Damon Blackshear at UFC Denver in 15 seconds. And I'm a massive Damon Blackshear fan. I thought he beat Mario Bautista at UFC 292 last year in Boston. But truly, I am a massive Damon Blackshear fan. And for Montel Jackson to go down there and absolutely light him up down the pipe is a very impressive feat for Montel Jackson. I think that he possesses a lot of power. I think he possesses a lot of skill in the UFC. And I think he's a good, well-rounded fighter going into the organization. And I think he can do big things going up into the top 15 in the UFC bantamweight division. I currently have Montel Jackson at number 12 because I think that there is a couple bantamweights at back end of the top 15 who truly aren't the greatest in the standpoint and are there because they're older or their ranking just isn't a very good indication of where they truly are. But Montel Jackson, in my opinion, is at number 12 of the UFC bantamweight rankings. At number 14, I have Jonathan Martinez, or Jonathan Martinez is the 14th ranked fighter, and in my list, he stays at number 14. Jonathan Martinez just fought Jose Aldo Jr. at UFC 301 in the co-main event where he kind of got absolutely bodied by Jose Aldo Jr. And truly, it was one of those performances that I was genuinely confused by watching Jonathan Martinez get absolutely outclassed by one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. You know, if this was a fighter with prime Jose Aldo Jr., I would understand completely, but Jonathan Martinez really got bodied in that fight by someone who was a lot older and who has the worst arm tattoo inside the UFC because that thing is awful. But ultimately, Jonathan Martinez has got some good skills. He's got some good takedowns. He's an okay striker, but I think he still lands at number 14 on my list. I don't think it's really changed, but ultimately, Jonathan Martinez staying in that slot, I think, is very valid, considering that he is a younger fighter. He has a bright future ahead of him, and two, he just got to get back on the win column against someone who is a little lower and out of the rankings over him. And at 13 in the UFC bantamweight rankings, it is Dominick Cruz, and Dominick Cruz truly is one of those fighters who in the UFC should be retired by now. He is so old, and he is going in there to where his chin is just not the same. There's all these memes of him going around his house with broken legs and broken backs and all this different type of stuff, and that's why I currently have him slotted at number 15, just because I think he really needs to retire outside the UFC. I think a lot of unranked bantamweight fighters can beat him, but I think his legacy and his just absolute dominance when he was currently in the bantamweight division, or when he was very dominant force in the bantamweight division, was very prominent. Against his last fight against Chito Vera, he got absolutely bodied by Vera in that fourth round by a left high kick right to the dome, broke his nose, and knocked him out cold. But ultimately, Dominick Cruz was a very dominant champion when he was currently in the UFC and a lot younger, but now him being older, I think is a better thing for him to retire rather than keep fighting. So that's why I have Dominick Cruz at number 15 of the UFC bantamweight rankings. At number 12, in the UFC bantamweight rankings, there is Mario Bautista, and I have Mario Bautista at number 13, moving down one slot, but because I think that Montel Jackson's win over Damon Blackshear and Mario Bautista's win over Damon Blackshear were two different things, so I just had him one slot over. But Mario Bautista is a very good fighter inside the UFC bantamweight division. I think he has a lot of promise going forward, and truly, I think that he holds some of the biggest, just well-rounded ability. He beat Ricky Simon, I think, earlier this year, and that was a very dominant fight, if I remember watching that one. He was going in there, and he was beating Ricky Simon, who is a pretty good UFC bantamweight, and he was doing everything that he could to truly go in there and dismantle Ricky Simón in a very dominant fashion. But ultimately, I think Mario Bautista has a very dominant future in front of him. I think he could go into the top 5 of the UFC Bantamweight rankings if he gets some favorable matchups, and he could possibly challenge for a title one day. That's how good I think Mario Bautista is. I don't think that's right now. I think that's in a couple years, but Bautista just got to get some fights scheduled. He just got to stay to his course and hopefully not get matched up against some of these killers who are up above him. But like I said, I have Mario Bautista at number 13, and he is number 12 in the UFC Bantamweight rankings on the UFC website. At number 11 on mine and the UFC website's UFC Bantamweight rankings is Kyler Phillips. Kyler Phillips was super impressive at his UFC 299 performance against Pedro Munhoz. Pedro Munhoz is an absolute veteran of the sport, and for Kyler Phillips to go in there and absolutely just put an absolute masterclass on him was a very impressive performance. Truly, Kyler Phillips is so fast. He's got such good boxing, and he's going to go into this UFC top 10 of the bantamweight division. I think he's going to have some favorable matchups coming up here, even though some of this division is super stacked getting into the top 10. I think he could beat people possibly like Henry Cejudo, Rob Font, possibly Jose Aldo. But truly, I think that Kyler Phillips has a very bright future ahead of him. And I think if he goes in there and properly picks the next fight and signs the next fight, I think he's going to have a very good success inside the top 10 of the UFC bantamweight division. He stays at number 11 on my list, and he is number 11 on the UFC's current top 15 bantamweights list. At number 10 on the UFC's bantamweight rankings is Umar Nurmagomedov, and Umar is one of those fighters who is so well-rounded. He comes from the Khabib camp, and Khabib is actually going to be in his corner this weekend when he fights Cory Sandhagan in Abu Dhabi this weekend in the main event, and apparently the winner is going to get a title shot off that event, which is a very massive feat going in there. But I think Umar Nurmagomedov is one of the most well-rounded UFC bantamweights, and I think he's an absolute killer in that division, and I have him at the number 5 ranked UFC bantamweight. I didn't want to put him any higher because he hasn't proven himself over worthy competition, but I do think that he is one of the best UFC bantamweights currently in the division. I think that Umar can go in there and he can strike, and he has a lot better striking than someone like Khabib because he is a lot more calculated, but he does possess that same grappling ability that all those Dagestani Russians have. And I think that Umar going into this fight with Sandhagan is a very hard fight for Umar, but I do think that he can win because of how good and how well-rounded he is, as well as how well coached he is under that Khabib Nurmagomedov camp. Him being at number 10 on the UFC rankings is just because he hasn't fought anyone above him and really proven himself in the rankings. But this Cory Sandhagan fight is a massive step up in competition. If Cory Sandhagan wins this fight, this is a massive star on his legacy. And if Umar Nurmagomedov wins this fight, that is a massive star in his legacy because of how good Cory Sandhagan is in the UFC bantamweight division. And truly, whoever wins this definitely needs to get a title shot next because this is the UFC bantamweight fight to be had and is 100% the best bantamweight fight to be made in the division right now, besides one of these guys fighting Sean O'Malley for the title. At number 9 in the UFC bantamweight rankings, it is Rob Font. I have Rob Font moving down one slot to number 10. Rob Font is a really good fighter, but his IQ questions me sometimes of how he's just, in that Cory Sandhagan fight, of how he genuinely couldn't get off the ground. Cory Sandhagan is a natural striker. He has some jiu-jitsu ability, but he has really improved on his wrestling. But he's not like a natural wrestler, and Rob Font just looked absolutely confused on the ground against him, and that was something that was a massive red flag to me. But Rob Font's a good striker, knocking out Adrian Yanez at UFC 287 on that Israel Adesanya Alex Pereira card, which is a very massive performance. Rob Font's a little bit older. He's got absolutely bodied by Chito Vera, where he was getting head kicked and a bunch of different stuff, where I genuinely think that Rob Font inside the UFC bantamweight division is a little bit of a stepping stone getting older, but that still doesn't mean that he's not a good bantamweight. Truly, Rob Font has some great performances under him. He's got a very good, nice legacy inside that bantamweight division, being that top 10, being top 5 fighter inside that division. I think Rob Font is a good fighter. He's got I think he's still got a lot of tread on the tires going left if he fights some favorable matchups. And ultimately, Rob Font sliding down one spot isn't a testament to Rob Font being a bad fighter, rather than the UFC bantamweight division being absolutely loaded. At number 8 in the UFC bantamweight division is Jose Aldo Jr., and I have Jose Aldo Jr. sliding down one spot as well to number 9 in the UFC bantamweight division. But Jose Aldo Jr. looked amazing against Jonathan Martinez, and that was a very massive surprise to me considering how old he is and of how long he's been in the sport. Jose Aldo Jr. left the MMA world to go box, and then he re-signed with the UFC to come fight Jonathan Martinez at UFC 301. And I think him winning that fight actually kind of solidified him staying in the organization. I think Jose Aldo Jr. being so old isn't a really great thing for pushing up into the rankings to get the title shot. Now, his name might grant him a title shot being, a lot older and whatnot, but he's going to have to beat one of these young and hungry dogs. If he goes up against Song Yadong, I really do not think he beats Song. And there's a bunch of other fighters that he's going to have to go in there and beat. But ultimately, I think Jose Aldo Jr. is one of the best bantamweights of all time. Not saying that he shouldn't be higher in the UFC bantamweight rankings because that's an all-time thing rather than a right now thing, but Jose Jr. sliding down one spot, same thing as Rob Font. It's not a testament to him being a bad fighter, rather how loaded the UFC bantamweight division currently is. At number 7 in the UFC's bantamweight rankings is Song Yadong, and I have Song Yadong at number 4 in my rankings. Song Yadong is one of my favorite fighters inside the UFC. He has so much power and such good grappling ability to where he is a very hard matchup for a lot of these other bantamweights. He had an incredibly close fight at UFC 299 against Petr Yan, one of the most stacked cards, by the way, thinking about it in recent memory. That was a very close fight against Petr Yan, but he did get the decision loss, and I did have that because Petr Yan was kind of doing everything at will in those final 2 rounds after Song took the first round off of him. But his Ricky Simón performance was incredibly impressive. His Chris Gutierrez performance was incredibly impressive. And that Cory Sandhagan performance was very impressive before that cut went in there. Song Yadong is one of the hardest power punchers inside the UFC, and he's got a very high IQ as well as a very athletic fighter. I think Song Yadong possesses all the traits needed in a very good UFC bantamweight, and unlike Umar Nurmagomedov, he has tested himself against some of the better UFC bantamweights and has put up a fight and beat some of the better UFC bantamweights currently in the division. I think Song Yadong is a future UFC bantamweight champion. I truly am super high on him, and I love watching him fight. He is one of those fighters that genuinely fills me with adrenaline every single time I see him fight because of how much power he possesses in every single aspect and every single punch he throws while having good cardio inside the UFC. Song Yadong is at number 4 in my UFC bantamweight list and is at number 7 in the UFC's UFC bantamweight rankings. At number 6 is Devidson Figueredo, and I actually have Figueredo staying at number 6 in my UFC bantamweight rankings. Figueredo is one of those fighters who is so talented, and he was one of the longest tenured UFC flyweight champions, where he had an absolute war with Brandon Moreno for 4 different fights, where he won fight 3, he tied in fight 1, and lost 2 and 4. But Figueredo at the UFC bantamweight division, I think, is a better spot for him because he's not cutting as much weight. I think his power is going to still be there, as well as giving him a better chin against these fighters. He beat Cody Garbrandt at UFC 300, and he fought Rob Font at UFC Austin last year, which was a very dominant performance for Devidson Figueredo. I think Figueredo is going to be able to establish himself as the bantamweight division as one of the best fighters. He's fighting Chito Vera coming up this weekend at UFC Abu Dhabi, to where I think that is a very dominant fight and a very good win possibly for Devidson Figueredo because of how he can mix up every single facet of his game. Devidson Figueredo on one of my list, and the UFC list is number 6. I truly think that he's a very talented fighter and could push to challenge for a UFC bantamweight title because of how good and how well-rounded he is inside the UFC bantamweight division. Ultimately, this ranking at number 6 for both the UFC and my rankings is 100% justified, considering of how dangerous of a fighter Devidson Figueredo is. At number 5 in the UFC's bantamweight rankings is Henry Cejudo, and I actually have Henry Cejudo pushed down to number 8, and I'll tell you why. Henry Cejudo, looking against Merab Dvalishvili, looked genuinely like he had no cardio in that fight, and that was the biggest red flag to me. In that first round, he was actually doing very good versus Merab, hitting him with a good couple of shots, hitting him with some leg kicks, but in those final 2 rounds, he just looked outclassed in there, and yes, Merab has a cardio style which could be influencing my pick on him, but genuinely, he looked incredibly confused inside there, and he just looked like he wasn't ready to keep fighting. I understand that Henry Cejudo came back to the sport possibly to challenge for a title or to make money, one of the two, but I think Henry Cejudo is in a division that is truly one of the hardest in the UFC ever. And I think that he needs to fight a favorable matchup to get himself in the win column again before going up and pushing up against someone above him, like a Yadong, like a Petr Yan, like someone like that, because I think either one of those fighters will absolutely decimate Henry Cejudo in the UFC bantamweight division. But Henry Cejudo is a great wrestler. We all know he's an Olympic gold medalist in the wrestling department in 2012. But Henry Cejudo genuinely needs to take his time, get a fight that's a favorable matchup to get him back on track, because in that last fight, I don't know how much he really wanted to win. And ultimately, that's why I have Henry Cejudo at number 8 on my UFC bantamweight rankings. At number 4 in the UFC's bantamweight rankings is Chito Vera, and I have pushed Chito Vera down to number 7, and I'll tell you why. Chito Vera is a very one-dimensional, stylistic fighting way to fight. He fought Sean O'Malley at UFC 299, and he was absolutely outclassed in that fight because of how dynamic Sean O'Malley is, and that same thing happened with Cory Sandhagan because of how dynamic Cory Sandhagan is. Some of these very, very, very good UFC strikers can outclass Chito Vera because Chito Vera is a very big power quality over quantity striker. That fight against Dominick Cruz, he absolutely knocked him out cold with that left high kick, even though he was losing most of that fight. And the only reason that he was in the fight was because of those strong power punches he had. Against Frankie Edgar, he was losing that fight, and he knocked Frankie Edgar with a front kick. Chito Vera's ranking is solely based on how he can knock out opponents. The only very dominant fight that I remember him having was over Rob Font, where Rob Font's face looked absolutely atrocious against Chito Vera. But ultimately, Chito Vera is a great fighter. He's a very fun fighter. He's fighting Devidson Figueredo this weekend, which is going to be a very hard matchup for him, just because of how dynamic and of how well Devidson Figueredo can grapple. But I still do think Chito Vera has a chance. I think he's still a very good fighter and a very key player in the UFC bantamweight division. When you possess that much power and a granite chin, I forgot to talk about his chin. Chito Vera's the knee he ate from Sean O'Malley was absolutely impressive. I don't think any single other person in the world could eat that knee from Sean O'Malley. But ultimately, Chito Vera at number 7 is one of those things to truly, I think, is a very respectable decision considering how stacked the UFC bantamweight division and of how sadly one-dimensional Chito Vera's style is. At number 3 in the UFC's bantamweight rankings, and staying at number 3 in my rankings, is Petr Yan. Petr Yan is a former champion, and he had a bunch of wars with Aljamain Sterling, but him being a key part in the UFC bantamweight division is always one of the most fun things to see. He just fought Song Yadong at UFC 299 and had a very impressive performance, and he's coming off, 3 losses in a row, but those 3 losses, if I name them out, are not that bad. He lost to Merab Dvalishvili, who is currently challenging for the title. He lost to Aljamain Sterling, who was the former champion, and lost to Sean O'Malley, who is the current champion. So I think that those losses truly are not bad losses in Petr Yan's resume just because of the caliber of people he was fighting. Petr Yan is one of the most exciting fighters. He's got a very good striking game, also paired with a very good wrestling and high IQ style. In that fight against Sean O'Malley, that was one of the most exciting fights of 2022, and him going in there and taking a challenge upon an opponent who was truly one of the biggest question marks inside the UFC division. And knowing now of how good Sean O'Malley is was a very impressive performance of Petr Yan, because there was a lot of debate on whether Petr Yan won that fight. But ultimately, Petr Yan is a very big key player inside the UFC bantamweight division. One more win puts him right in the title conversations, and I truly do think Petr Yan could regain the UFC bantamweight title very, very soon. At number 2 in the UFC's bantamweight rankings, and my number 1 fighter in the UFC bantamweight division, is Cory Sandhagan. Cory Sandhagan is one of my favorite fighters inside the UFC, and I have just watched him fight some of the greatest fighters inside the organization. Song Yadong, who is a very good upcoming fighter. Cory Sandhagan dismantled by cut TKO. He beat Chito Vera in a very dominant fashion, 50 to 45, and talk about real quick, the judge who scored the fight 48 to 47 to Chito Vera was one of the worst scorecards I have ever seen inside the UFC, because Chito Vera didn't even get a round off of Cory Sandhagan. And then Cory Sandhagan went out there and beat Rob Font without a tricep, and he is fighting Umar Nurmagomedov this weekend for a number 1 contenders match in UFC Abu Dhabi, which I do think is a very hard fight for Cory Sandhagan, but a fight that he can definitely win. Cory Sandhagan has some of the best striking the UFC bantamweight division has ever seen, and he is one of, if not the highest IQ fighters inside the UFC. The way he's able to process different information, the way he's able to throw out different reads and read his opponents in ways that no one else understands is something that truly a lot of UFC fighters can't do and can't process. And Cory Sandhagan's ability and skills comes from his ability to over-process and over-calculate stuff. Cory Sandhagan has some of the greatest knockouts in UFC history. The flying knee against Frankie Edgar was absolutely amazing. The wheel kick against Marlon Moraes was absolutely disgusting. And some of those arm bars in his early career were absolutely disgusting. But Cory Sandhagan is one of the best fighters in the UFC bantamweight division. I think if he goes through Umar Nurmagomedov, I think he beats Sean O'Malley inside the UFC bantamweight division. But Sean O'Malley is a very hard fight for Cory Sandhagan because of how well-rounded he is and how good his takedown defense is. And his pre-takedown defense, I call it, with those knees that he possesses. But Cory Sandhagan is one of the best fighters inside the UFC bantamweight division. I think this fight against Umar Nurmagomedov is a must-watch fight in the UFC bantamweight division. And in the UFC's rankings at number 2, I haven't pushed up to the number 1 best UFC bantamweight under Sean O'Malley. The UFC's number 1 bantamweight and the number 2 bantamweight for me is Merab Dvalishvili. Merab is currently challenging Sean O'Malley for the UFC bantamweight title, which I think is a very interesting fight for Sean O'Malley, considering Merab's wrestling style. I think that Merab is going to go out there and try to wrestle right from the gate, and if he tries to strike with O'Malley, he's going to get knocked out immediately, and that is a massive disaster if he tries to do so. But Merab Dvalishvili's biggest asset is his cardio. He's a good fighter in the UFC, but the thing that really propels him to be one of the best inside the organization is that cardio that he possesses every single time he steps inside the UFC octagon. Merab's ability to go 5 rounds and not look like he even had a sweat is just absolutely amazing in my opinion, and that is 100% the reason that Merab Dvalishvili is the number 1 contender inside the UFC bantamweight division. He absolutely dismantled Petr Yan at a fight night in UFC in 2023 in March last year, and he came off a massive win against Henry Cejudo to where in the 3rd round he picked up Henry Cejudo like his baby and was carrying around him over his shoulder like he was about to give him a spanking or something like that, and threw him down on the ground in front of Mark Zuckerberg. If you have not watched that fight, that is a very fun fight. Merab Dvalishvili was a very good showman in that fight, but ultimately Merab Dvalishvili possesses some good striking. He's a very good wrestler. He doesn't really go for submissions rather than ground and pound and control time, but Merab has a very hard fight on his hands with Sean O'Malley, and I think that it is a very, very, very interesting fight between the two of these guys. I have Merab Dvalishvili as the number 2 UFC bantamweight on my rankings, but in the UFC's ranking, he is the number 1 ranked bantamweight. My number 1 ranked bantamweight and the champion that I have above every other bantamweight is Sean O'Malley. Sean O'Malley's striking is some of the best inside the UFC organization, and it is 100% probably number 2 right behind Alex Pereira after seeing Leon Edwards collapse this weekend against Bilal Muhammad. But I think Sean O'Malley possesses some of the best striking and takedown defense inside the UFC. Being a striker like that, you have to possess takedown defense because that's where Sean O'Malley makes his bread and butter. Because Sean O'Malley against Aljamain Sterling had a couple of takedowns attempted upon him, and he was able to defend them against one of the best back takers inside the UFC. I look at possible matchups with Cory Sandhagan and Petr Yan and Yadong. These are some of the most fun fights in the UFC bantamweight division to make because of Sean O'Malley's style going in there against a lot of these different fighters. And 2, Sean O'Malley is a very good jiu-jitsu artist. A lot of people don't understand of how good of a jiu-jitsu artist Sean O'Malley is and of how many different submissions he possesses inside the UFC. He can 100% go in there and submit some of the best grapplers inside the UFC division, and truly, I think that is a very underrated part of Sean O'Malley's game. Sean O'Malley has so many different ways to win fights, and I think his IQ is incredibly underrated inside the UFC. You look at his persona on the outside, and you see this guy who wears pink hair and has an afro and wears pink shorts and has these crazy tattoos, but Sean O'Malley is a very calculated and very good fighter inside the UFC bantamweight division. That's why he's the champion now in my best bantamweight currently in the UFC. Truly, I think that Sean O'Malley has the characteristics to be a long-reigning champion and has the ability to beat every single other bantamweight currently in the rankings. Sean O'Malley is my number 1 bantamweight, and he is the champion in the UFC bantamweight division for a reason. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Sales MMA and my full breakdown of the UFC bantamweight division. I want to recap real quick my top 15 list of the UFC bantamweights. I have Dominick Cruz at 15, Jonathan Martinez at 14, Mario Buatista at 13, Montel Jackson at 12, Kyler Phillips at 11, Rob Font at 10, Jose Aldo Jr. at 9, Henry Cejudo at 8, Chito Vera at 7, Devidson Figueredo at 6, Umar Nurmagomedov at 5, Yadong at 4, Petr Yan at 3, Merab Dvalishvili at 2, Cory Sandhagan at 1, and Sean O'Malley as the best UFC bantamweight. If you guys have any gripes about the list, or if you guys do enjoy the list, please leave a comment down below. That is the best way to support and for me to interact with me, so I get to review and read your guys' comments coming up when you do leave them. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight System MMA, and please hit the subscribe button. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, so please hit the button. It is the best way to show your support to my channel. And while you're down there, turn on the post notifications, because you guys will always be notified when more UFC content is released. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight System MMA, and stay tuned for more UFC fight news and breakdowns coming very, very soon.